Another topic that you have presented on a fair bit at conferences in the past is these ideas of applying rigor and skepticism to data validation and to create reproducible data workflows.
Mhm.
So tell us about these very broad, succinctly, tell us about these extremely broad concepts.
Of course, of course. I'll cover it in 5 minutes. Um, yeah, so I would say reproducibility is it's a real ongoing topic, not just in data science, but in science in general. So, um, I first started talking about this when I was pretty fresh out of academia, and one of the reasons I started talking about it is there was a very well documented reproducibility crisis that went on in psychology, in medicine, in economics, and probably in other sciences, but pretty much it got looked at most thoroughly in the social sciences and in medicine. And I can kind of see why it happens because the usual workflow is not designed for people to actually inspect the data that you used, to inspect the code that you used. And it's really only been a recent thing in academia where we've started to think about it. And I think a lot of data scientists, maybe coming from academic backgrounds, don't really tend to think about it in our work. And so it means like you do an analysis while you're in the middle of it, you're like, okay, this is fine, everything's working. And then you just drop it and you're like, I'm done. And then maybe you need to come back to it 6 months later and you're like, what did I do? Like, I can't
Mhm.
even get the environment to work. So for me, I think I've always seen it as not necessarily, um, not really, it's not really a matter of not caring. I think it's a matter of there's already so many things that you need to master. It's just an additional overhead it's not going to stop you doing your work in the immediate moment. But in order to add in checks and balances to ensure reproducibility can actually increase that overhead. And maybe you think, well, it's not worth it. So I mentioned earlier, I'm not going to kind of go on about it, but mentioned earlier that I think data law is perfectly set up for reproducibility. So that's one way in which tooling can enable that. But there's also sort of other ways you can use tooling. So, make sure if you are writing code, you document it as well as possible. You have doc strings, you include the input and return types. You make naming clearer. You tidy up your code as much as possible. You
Mm,
use the markdown properly. You actually explain
mhm.
your process and just make sure you've documented your environment somewhere. Like it's just
Right.
sort of small practices that should be changed. So yeah, I think it's not necessarily the easiest thing to get into the habit of doing, but it's definitely important. And I think, especially if something really important comes out of your research, you really should be able to reproduce it end to end later.